Just because there hasn't been a nuclear war before, it doesn't mean there can't be a nuclear war now, especially if NATO keep doing things that Vladimir Putin says will cause him to start a nuclear war. Is it possible the legacy media are trying to acclimate us to a nuclear war as if it's some normal thing that might just happen? They are! We're going to prove it. Hello there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on this voyage to truth and freedom. Remember, click the link in the description if you want to become part of this movement where you could possibly get a hat or even a t-shirt, which will be some comfort as the ash rains down radioactive from what used to be heaven and is now an all-encompassing hell thanks to the ignorance and stupidity of our globalist leaders. We make additional content every week. You get additional videos. You get to join us while we do interviews with important people. It's well worth it. It's brilliant. It's fun. Although everything's really got to take a bit of a backseat to the possibility of actual realised Armageddon. It's been admitted now that there is a kind of policy that includes the possibility of nuclear war, i.e. we're not behaving how we would have done 30, 40 years ago when it was good old Khrushchev, that great big eyebrow-faced lunatic, or JFK, and his Massachusetts drool, acknowledging that missiles being sent to Cuba was a moment that we perhaps ought step back and reflect a little. Now people are just talking about nuclear exchanges like it's some sort of just something that has to be considered and accepted. Let's have a look at Vladimir Putin talking about what NATO troops in Ukraine actually means, because it seems that we're just trying to edge this and rationalize this, as if you can use rationalism in the same way that rationalism has been used in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, like, oh, we can just use language to make it seem like this is not colonial and exploitative and awful and dreadful, or rationalism the way that it's used in Israel's current actions in Gaza, just like, oh, it's necessary and there are reasons for it. Yeah, we're actually sort of going mad as a planet, and that madness now seems to include inviting, accepting the potential of nuclear war. Let's have a look at that and radically reprioritize on that basis.
Vladimir Putin also warns the presence of Western troops in Ukraine could trigger a third world war. Putin's remarks come as Europe, particularly France, deliberates on proposal to send boots on the ground to reinforce Ukrainian troops. The Russian president says Moscow's troops were advancing in Ukraine each day. Putin also urges French President Emmanuel Macron to instead seek ways to peaceful solutions.
Maybe it's because everything seems to move so quickly now. There's such an abundance of media. You might not even be bothered about this story in 10, 15 minutes. You might be watching something about Kate Middleton, or you might be watching something about Elon Musk, all things which have fascinating connotations and can be analysed and deconstructed to within an inch of your life. But if you think of the last 100 years, which isn't that long in the history of a planet, countries like France and countries like Russia and countries like America and Germany have been involved in wars. And it's been because of disputes that are comparable to the disputes that are happening now. Small regionalised wars in which allies support the smaller of the fighting forces have the potential to escalate. We're literally hiding behind bureaucratic terms and institutions like NATO, pretending that what's happening isn't an escalation of tensions with a major nuclear superpower. So what you would have first thought using common sense when all of these conversations began a few years back, when you hear Joe Biden actually then say, oh, of course we could never put boots on the ground because that would mean World War III, for Christ's sake. I think that's a literal quote.
We will not fight a war against Russia in Ukraine. Direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is World War III, something we must strive to prevent.
Or when you've heard that NATO have been involved in Ukrainian politics for quite a while, that there are CIA bases there, that we're sending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons there and sort of pretending that it's like aid rather than the arming of a military in favour of seeking a diplomatic solution, which Vladimir Putin, we all know, is up for under certain conditions, which will obviously be favourable conditions to Russia. But to deny Russia the right to those favourable conditions is to essentially invite the possibility of war. And you and I are not being told the truth about that. In fact, the legacy media seem to be normalising the possibility of this endless escalation rather than pointing out just how terrifying this situation is.
Russia's European neighbors to the west swiftly criticizing Putin's election victory. Germany's foreign ministry called the polls a pseudo-election that is neither free nor fair. It also said the election in the occupied territories of Ukraine are null and void and a breach of international law. For Britain's Foreign Secretary David Cameron, the illegal elections in Ukrainian territory, the lack of choice for voters, and no independent monitoring is not what free and fair elections look like.
Now might be a good time to tell you that there have been no elections in Ukraine for a little while now, and that all of their media has been centralised, and that Zelensky's done a bunch of deals with like BlackRock and JP Morgan for the rebuilding of the country. And you have to choose your tyranny. I'm like not saying, why would I say that Russia isn't a tyrannical place and isn't using veiled bureaucratic trickery to pretend that there is democracy happening. But actually, even as I hear myself saying those words, I think, oh my God, the same thing's happening in your country and my country. We're doing it everywhere. The same sets of institutions that hold power will remain unaffected by the outcome of any election. That's how it works, isn't it?
Macron keeps saying about possibility of sending French European troops to Ukraine, and that's a matter of concern for the European nations. How do you think the full-fledged conflict between Russia and NATO, is it possible, and how probable is it?
At this point, I just would pause to invite you to consider, do you think that you, if you are French or if you are American or if you're Finnish or Swedish or whatever, should be involved in whether or not your country uses your money to escalate tensions with Russia? Or do you think there should be some kind of referendum where they go, hey, listen, Putin's actions in Ukraine are continuing. He does say that there is a peace deal available, but it will, of course, involve territorial secessions along the lines that Russia would have sort of offered at the beginning. Do you really care about that more than you care about, for example, having a house and having children and pets? Oh, no, I care about democracy in Ukraine. I think they should have it there, and I think they should have democracy in Russia. But what I really, really, really care about is having a house and a cat and streets and like breath and trees and everything. So I'm going to vote for stop having wars and provoking the shit out of someone with nuclear weapons. And every time they go, he's a madman, he's a tyrant, I'm like, yeah, leave him alone.
Well, I think everything is possible in the modern world, and as I said before, and it is clear to everyone that this will be one step away from a full-fledged World War III. I do not think anyone is interested in this.
Their only answer to that kind of rhetoric is, oh, he wouldn't do that, he's only bluffing. And elsewhere, they provide a context of Putin as a madman. In the same way that they say Trump is a madman. In the same way that they say Tucker Carlson is a madman, or Elon Musk is a madman, or anyone who's a threat to the institutional globalist powers that truly dominate countries like yours and mine. They have no answer or any suggestion that they could improve or change the way that they govern the world. That's not up for discussion. The only thing they can do is double down on that guy's mad, these guys are mad and racist, and we're having these wars. Why? Because of protecting the vulnerable. It just doesn't actually make any sense.
It is up to them, ultimately.
We can't make this content without your love and support, and without the support of our sponsors, who we always select on the basis of effective products, like today's. Have you noticed that recently clusters of respiratory illnesses in northern China and what's been referred to as white lung syndrome in the United States are scattered across the headlines? There's hashtag white lung. They're drawing attention, I believe, to the importance of being prepared for medical emergencies. With close to 90% of pharmaceuticals in the US being produced outside of the country, what will happen when the inevitable next global crisis strikes? Countries will clamp down on exports. They'll stockpile. The price of drugs will rise, and the pharmacy shelves in America, they say, will empty. Is it already starting to happen? Well, the Wellness Company's medical emergency kit has got you covered for times like this. The Wellness Company is home to Dr. Peter McCulloch and Dr. Drew Pinsky. They've both been guests on our show. They're truth-telling doctors who are empowering you to take control of your health. 40% of Americans say they would avoid a doctor or hospital unless it was a catastrophic situation. The Wellness Company's medical emergency kit provides a solution. This handy little kit includes 8 potentially life-saving medications for you, along with a guidebook for safe use, emergency antibiotics, antivirals and antiparasitics to keep you and your family safe in the face of natural disasters, supply chain shortages, or medical emergencies like white lung or COVID. Go to twc.health/brand and grab your medical emergency kit right now. That's twc.health/brand. Code brand saves you 10% at checkout. So if you use the code brand, you'll get 10% off. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control of your health with the Wellness Company's medical emergency kit. Thank you. Now, let's get into this.
If someone wants to cover their internal political problems with this kind of rhetoric, well, that's a well-known trick that is being used quite often.
Sometimes I extract the critiques of Putin from what Putin is saying, i.e. do people use war to palliate and distract domestic populations? Yes, that's been acknowledged. We know that that's what like the Gulf War and Falklands War are about. In particular, I'm talking about in UK politics, Vietnam War, Korean War. Of course they do. War is a good distraction. So whether you think Putin is crazy and a warmonger or not, and let's just say, yeah, he is, that doesn't mean that that's not true. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be involved in our nation's policies when it comes to the provocation of Russia and escalation of conflict with them.
I wouldn't want to see France playing this role of exacerbating, escalating, provoking the conflict.
Me and him.
I would like to see it more discussing possible peaceful solutions, something that the other journalist has been speaking about, so they can play their role. Not everything is lost, but I would like to end with the words of gratitude to the Russian people, to the Russian voters. Once again, I would like to emphasize we will do everything in our power to accomplish the goals of the national development in all areas. Thank you. Goodbye.
God, he ends his speeches abruptly, didn't he? He's like the opposite of Joe Biden. It's like he's still talking. He's like, whoa, Vladimir, where are you going? Joe Biden will be wandering around for another couple of minutes there. So there you go, a clear threat of potential nuclear war in countries like France and the UK, which are sort of easier, I imagine, to hit with nuclear missiles than Missouri or Memphis or Massachusetts. So, you know, if you are English watching this, you might want to think about what your position is. So how do the legacy media make the prospect of nuclear war appealing, as if it's, I don't know, air fryers? Yeah, it's a new thing, nuclear war now. You can cook your chicken in this. Oh, my teeth. On Sunday, the New York Times published an article by David Sanger titled Biden's Armageddon Moment When Nuclear Detonation Seemed Possible in Ukraine. The article documents extensive and far-reaching discussions within the Biden administration in late 2022 regarding the possibility of the war with Russia turning into a nuclear conflict. Sanger reports that the Central Intelligence Agency told Biden that under a singular scenario in which Ukrainian forces decimated Russian defensive lines and looked as if they might try to retake Crimea, a possibility that seemed imaginable that fall, the likelihood of nuclear use might rise to 50% or even higher. When you think about the language around climate change and the environment and measures that may or may not be deployed for the preservation of the planet, which I'll note here always seem to involve the persecution of ordinary people rather than institutional changes in massive corporations and elites not using the privileged means of transport that they often use, it's climate change and the environment are spoken about sort of in almost hysterical terms. Here, the potential for the chance of there being a nuclear war raising by 50%, which was sort of like people like chewing pencils, like, yeah, I suppose that is a lot more likely. Seems like the threat of Armageddon should be discussed in the same sort of way, regardless of what's causing it. He reported that the Biden administration was making urgent preparations for a US reaction to a Russian nuclear detonation. So in private conversations, top secret, to which we are not privy, they go, so what if there is a nuclear war? Well, obviously we'll be okay because we got bunkers in Hawaii, but, you know, we'll win it. We'll win it, and in the post-nuclear war environment, by God, we'll thrive. I mean, how long does that guy want to live? An article written by Sanger, a long-time mouthpiece for the US military and intelligence agencies, is less a news article than the controlled release of information by the US intelligence agencies. The purpose of this article is to acclimate the public to the possibility of the war becoming nuclear. It is also an attempt to place the onus on Russia. You started it. It's your fault there's a nuclear war. It's not children anymore, like someone's pulled someone else's hair and then they've been kicked in the shins or whatever. This is, but you've ruined everything. Everything. I mean, unless there is an Atlantis, and unless there have been previous civilizations lost and long forgotten, this has been an uninterrupted ascent from the Garden of Eden, and you've spoiled it. Proud of yourself. Yeah, sorry. It is also an attempt to place the onus on Russia when it is, in fact, the US and NATO powers that are engaged in a massive escalation of the war, potentially involving the direct deployment of NATO troops to Ukraine. Over the past 2 weeks, 4 NATO countries, France, Canada, Lithuania and the Netherlands, have stated their openness to sending NATO troops to fight Russia in Ukraine. On Saturday, they were joined by Poland, whose Foreign Minister, Radek Sikorski, declared that sending troops to Ukraine was not unthinkable. It sort of is, though. It sort of is unthinkable. I mean, if what they were saying is true, that Putin's war with Ukraine is not a regional dispute provoked by the 2014 coup and impingement by NATO on former Soviet territories, but it's the beginning of a campaign to sort of go west and take over the world, then, and only then, would you say, oh, well, we can't yield to this madman. And I suppose that's why they're trying to portray him in that way. But anything other than an inevitable Russian plan for total domination of the globe means that peace and diplomacy would be favourable. And I've not seen anything from our side, actually, or theirs, that suggests that Russia are planning to take over. There's no evidence for that. There's no evidence for that. It's the same as like there might be interdimensional beings that are dominating, but it's difficult to corroborate. You've got to corroborate that. Is Putin trying to take over the world, or is it more likely that he's being used as a bogeyman to legitimise authoritarianism in our own nations, as Putin actually suggested in his own speech? These statements were accompanied by the release of a recording of a discussion by members of the German military of the prospect of using German long-range weapons to carry out strikes on Russian territory, as well as leaks from Germany that Britain were deploying troops in Ukraine already, which amounts to another escalation of these tensions. And in fact, because Ukraine couldn't continue this war without NATO support and without US financial support, ultimately that is the determining and deciding factor. So already there is a war between NATO and the US, because if you took the US and NATO out of it, the war would be over. So that's just logic, isn't it? And reason. So we're already in this war, and what we're witnessing now is the slow incremental inculcation of normalising it, so that we just go, oh, well, we're just in this nuclear war now. Bloody Putin. The immediate context for these actions is a series of disastrous setbacks for the Ukrainian war effort, raising the prospect of a total collapse of the Ukrainian army without direct NATO intervention. So there's no longer support for Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, can't win a war against Russia in the same way that Mexico couldn't win a war against America, even if you were to legitimize some conflict of that nature by saying, well, you know, the way that California and Texas were taken, that's not really fair, is it? And the way that migrants are treated, and maybe, you know, you could come up with some reason to have wars and to support it. And what if people started to support Mexico? I mean, how would that go? As a recent article in Foreign Affairs warns, without a surge in Western military aid and major changes to Kiev's strategy, Ukraine's battlefield position will continue to worsen until it reaches a tipping point, possibly by this summer. In other words, NATO has a window of just a few months to avoid a precipitous collapse of the Ukrainian military. Sanger's article admits that in 2022, under conditions where the Russian military was facing a series of setbacks, the US evaluated that it was entirely possible for Russia to use nuclear weapons to improve its military position. But it is NATO and the United States that now find themselves on the back foot, suffering serious defeats. If the Biden administration believed that Russia would use nuclear weapons in order to forestall military defeat, is that any less true for the US and NATO? In a critical passage, Sanger writes, the wargaming at the Pentagon and think tanks around Washington imagined that Mr. Putin's use of a tactical weapon involved a demand from Moscow that the West halt all military support for the Ukrainians. No more tanks, no more missiles, no more ammunition. But this is precisely the position that NATO is driving Russia to take by planning to deploy NATO troops to Ukraine. Every escalation by NATO raises the pressure for the Russian government to set an explicit red line to be enforced by the threat to strike NATO territory or use nuclear weapons. The NATO powers recognise the very real danger that the conflict in Ukraine could develop into a nuclear war, but they are taking no measures to avoid escalation. Instead of discussing negotiations that could avert this catastrophe, they are continuing to pursue a policy that could well result in a nuclear conflict with Russia. Having feared that a nuclear apocalypse could break out in 2022, the Biden administration and its NATO allies are now escalating the war to the point where that scenario becomes more likely than ever. So for some time it seemed possible that a conflict that even involves Russia has the potential to escalate to the point where it could be deleterious, decimating for the entire planet. That seems to remain likely, and rather than acknowledge that likelihood explicitly through legacy media, it seems that the chosen path is to normalise that prospect and even suggest that it would be possible for NATO and the US to strike first in an escalating conflict that now plainly could be said to be between NATO, using the vassal of Ukraine, and Russia, who have their own territorial and potentially even imperialist intentions towards Ukraine, to whom I could not be more sympathetic, and even my glibness should be couched that I personally am putting the country that I live in and my own interests ahead of Ukraine's, particularly given that in a nuclear war all Ukrainians would also die. So surely what all reasonable people ought to be demanding is actual independent referenda in our own nation, so we can decide whether we want the funding of this war to continue or whether we want our nation's persuasiveness, particularly that of the United States of America, to be deployed in pursuit of peace. A peace that was apparently available 2 or 3 years ago, but that the United States and the UK, in the figure of Boris Johnson, scuppered for reasons that I still don't fully understand, because things haven't been great for Ukraine since then. They've suffered more annihilation, more death, the decimation of their army, the desecration of their towns and provinces and culture and standing in the world. So I don't know who is benefiting, but this in a context where we start to get the sense that authoritarianism is using crisis to legitimize more centralized power, to legitimize more censorship, to legitimize more control, makes a kind of vague overall sense in terms of the more there is crisis, the more there is fear, the more there is the reason to bend towards authority, to be subdued, to lose your own sort of personal sense of sovereignty and freedom. And it's only using sort of intuition as well as common sense when it comes to the matter of Russia's nuclear capacity that I can even understand this, because from the legacy media, what we're given is something like a sort of haiku of misinformation and propaganda that's leading us, increasingly it seems, towards nuclear war. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments and chat? Remember, click the link in the description, support our movement if you can, but more important than that, please stay free.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.